The year was 1958, and in the humid air of Stone Town, Zanzibar, a 12-year-old boy named Farrokh Bulsara stood beside his parents at the departure gate of the local airfield. His small suitcase contained everything he would need for the journey ahead, a journey that would take him thousands of miles away from everything he had ever known. This wasn't a vacation or a brief visit to relatives. This was a farewell that would echo through the corridors of music history, though none of them could have known it then. Bomi and Jerbul Sara watched their eldest child with hearts heavy with love and determination. The decision to send Farrokh to St. Peter's School in Panchgani, India, had not come easily. For months they had discussed it in hushed conversations after the children had gone to bed, weighing the pain of separation against the promise of opportunity. In their modest home overlooking the Indian Ocean, they had made calculations that went beyond mere mathematics. They were calculating their son's future. The boarding school represented everything they could not provide on the island of Zanzibar. While their life was comfortable by local standards, Bomi worked as a cashier for the British Colonial Office, and Jer managed their household with the precision of a woman who understood the value of every shilling. They saw in their precocious son a spark that deserved to be kindled into something extraordinary. But that spark could only be nurtured in places where opportunity flourished, and in 1958, those places were far from their tropical paradise. As young Farrokh shifted nervously from foot to foot, his parents fought back tears they refused to shed in front of him. They had spent weeks preparing him for this moment, explaining how the education at St. Peter's would open doors that simply didn't exist on Zanzibar. They spoke of the prestigious institution nestled in the hill station of Panchgani, where the air was crisp and clean, where teachers from England brought the finest educational traditions to eager young minds. They painted pictures of libraries filled with books, laboratories equipped with the latest instruments, and music rooms where his budding interest in piano could flourish under proper guidance. But beneath these practical explanations lay a deeper truth, one that Bomi and Jer carried like a sacred trust. They believed their son was destined for something remarkable. Even at 12, Farrokh displayed an intensity and creativity that set him apart. His drawings filled the margins of his school notebooks with elaborate doodles and fantastical creatures. His conversations sparkled with questions that revealed a mind constantly reaching beyond the familiar boundaries of island life. When he sat at the old upright piano in their neighbor's house, his fingers found melodies that seemed to come from some inner source of music that even he didn't fully understand yet. The sacrifice they were making extended far beyond the financial burden of boarding school fees. They were surrendering the daily joy of watching their son grow, the evening conversations over dinner, the comfort of tucking him into bed each night. Jer would no longer be able to brush his hair each morning or ensure he ate properly. Bomi would miss the walks along the waterfront where father and son would discuss everything from the ships in the harbor to the stars emerging in the twilight sky. They were trading the precious intimacy of family life for the abstract promise of their child's potential. As the departure time approached, Farrokh looked up at his parents with eyes that held both excitement and apprehension. He understood, in the way that intelligent children do, that this moment marked the end of his childhood as he had known it. The island where he had learned to swim in warm turquoise waters, where he had climbed the ancient baobab trees, where he had listened to the call to prayer echoing across the stone buildings of the old town. All of this would now become memory rather than daily experience. The airplane that would carry him away sat on the tarmac like a silver promise, its engines warming up with a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into their bones. Other families were saying their goodbyes nearby, but for the Bulsaras, this moment felt entirely their own, suspended between love and loss, between the familiar comfort of home and the unknown adventure that awaited their precious son in the hills of India. Years later, when Farrokh had become Freddie Mercury and his voice was filling stadiums around the world, music critics and biographers would trace the origins of his artistry to many sources. But perhaps none was more profound than this moment of departure, when love looked like letting go, when parents chose their child's dreams over their own hearts, and when a 12-year-old boy began the journey that would transform him from a homesick student into one of the greatest performers the world has ever known. The boarding school experience that awaited him would be marked by loneliness and homesickness, but also by the discovery of talents that might have remained buried in the comfortable routines of island life. At St. Peter's, surrounded by boys from across the Indian subcontinent and beyond, Farrokh would learn to channel his isolation into creativity, his longing for home into music that could bridge any distance. The piano lessons that began as a way to fill empty afternoons would become the foundation for compositions that would move millions. The friendships forged in the dormitories would teach him about loyalty and collaboration, lessons that would serve him well when he later formed Queen with 3 other young men who shared his vision of musical greatness. As the final boarding announcement echoed across the airfield, the Bulsara family shared one last embrace. In that moment, wrapped in his parents' arms, young Farrokh absorbed a love so profound that it would sustain him through the difficult months ahead. He would carry their sacrifice with him like a talisman, understanding even in his youth that he had been given a gift that came wrapped in temporary pain but promised lasting transformation. The boy who walked toward that airplane carried within him the hopes and dreams of parents who loved him enough to let him go, who believed in him enough to endure their own heartbreak for the sake of his future. This was not abandonment. This was love in its most courageous form, love that looked beyond the present moment toward possibilities that could only be realized through temporary separation and the faith that their son would find his way to greatness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty courtyard of St. Peter's School in Panchgani, India, as a small figure clutched a worn leather satchel against his chest. 12-year-old Farrokh Bulsara stood frozen at the imposing iron gates, watching unfamiliar faces stream past him in pressed uniforms and polished shoes. The boy who would one day command the world's greatest stages as Freddie Mercury had never felt smaller or more alone than in this moment, abandoned by the very people who claimed to love him most. But this story of separation begins not with cruelty, but with a love so profound it demanded the unthinkable. In the bustling streets of Stone Town, Zanzibar, Bomi, and Jer Bulsara faced an impossible choice that would haunt their dreams and shape their son's destiny forever. The year was 1958, and the political winds of change were sweeping across East Africa like a gathering storm. The Zanzibar Revolution loomed on the horizon, threatening to tear apart the peaceful coexistence that had allowed their Parsi family to flourish for generations. Bomi Bulsara worked as a cashier at the British Colonial Office, a position that placed him squarely in the crosshairs of rising nationalist sentiment. Each morning, he walked the familiar coralstone streets to his office, feeling the subtle shifts in the air, the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when he passed. At home, Jer would watch her husband's troubled face over evening meals, both parents acutely aware that their children's futures hung in the balance of forces beyond their control. The Bulsara household had always been filled with music and laughter. Young Farrokh would sit at their old upright piano, picking out melodies with stubby fingers, while his younger sister Kashmira giggled nearby. Bomi would return from work to find his son humming strange new combinations of notes, already displaying an instinctive understanding of harmony that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his soul. These were precious moments, but increasingly overshadowed by the weight of difficult decisions. Education had always been sacred to the Bulsara family. As Parsis, they understood that knowledge was both armor and weapon against an uncertain world. But the local schools in Zanzibar, while adequate, could not provide the level of education they envisioned for their brilliant, sensitive son. India beckoned with its prestigious boarding schools, institutions that had shaped generations of leaders and thinkers. St. Peter's School in Panchgani enjoyed a reputation for academic excellence and character building, exactly what ambitious parents might dream of for their child. Yet sending Farrokh away meant confronting their deepest fears. Jer would lie awake at night, imagining her boy alone in a dormitory hundreds of miles away, homesick and confused. Bomi struggled with the masculine expectation to remain stoic, while his heart broke at the thought of missing years of his son's childhood. They were caught between their protective instincts and their desperate desire to give Farrokh every possible advantage in life. The decision crystallized during a particularly tense evening when news reached them of increasing unrest in neighboring territories. Bomi sat his wife down at their small dining table, the same table where they had celebrated birthdays and shared family meals, and spoke the words that would change everything. They had to send Farrokh to boarding school, not because they wanted to, but because they could not bear the thought of his potential being limited by circumstances beyond their control. The weeks leading up to departure became a delicate dance of preparation and suppressed emotion. Jer methodically packed her son's belongings, each folded shirt and carefully chosen book representing a small act of love across the distance that would soon separate them. She slipped extra sweets into his trunk, knowing they would provide poor substitute for a mother's embrace during lonely nights ahead. Farrokh, meanwhile, oscillated between excitement at the adventure and a growing dread he could not fully articulate. The night before his departure, the family gathered around their piano one last time. Farrokh played the simple melodies he had learned, his parents flanking him on the bench, their voices joining his in songs that had been passed down through generations of their Parsi heritage. The music filled their small home with bittersweet harmony, a soundtrack to their sacrifice that would echo in their memories for years to come. At Zanzibar's small airport, the goodbye was both everything and nothing like they had imagined. Jer held her son close, whispering prayers in his ear while Bomi stood nearby, his jaw clenched against the emotion threatening to overwhelm his composure. Farrokh, trying to be brave for his parents' sake, managed a wavering smile as he promised to write every week and make them proud. The plane that would carry him to India sat on the tarmac like a great metal bird, ready to bear their most precious cargo toward an uncertain future. As the aircraft lifted into the tropical sky, three hearts broke simultaneously in different ways. Bomi and Jer returned to a house that felt cavernously empty despite Kashmira's presence, while young Farrokh pressed his face to the small window, watching the island that held everything familiar disappear into the azure waters of the Indian Ocean. None of them could know that this moment of separation would forge the resilience and independence that would later fuel one of music's greatest legends. The journey to India stretched endlessly for a 12-year-old boy traveling alone. Fellow passengers, mostly British colonial administrators and Indian businessmen, paid little attention to the small figure in the window seat who tried so hard to appear confident while his stomach churned with anxiety. Farrokh had never been away from his family for more than a night, and now faced the prospect of months stretching into years before he would see them again. When the plane finally touched down in Bombay, the sensory assault was immediate and overwhelming. The humid air carried unfamiliar spices and industrial smoke, while the cacophony of languages, car horns, and street vendors created a symphony of chaos that bore no resemblance to the gentle rhythms of Stone Town. A school representative met him at the airport, a stern-faced man who checked his name off a clipboard and shepherded him toward a waiting car with businesslike efficiency. The drive to Panchgani wound through landscapes that might have been fascinating under different circumstances. Rolling hills gave way to dramatic valleys, and the cool mountain air provided relief from Bombay's oppressive heat. But Farrokh saw little of the scenery, lost in homesickness that felt like a physical ache in his chest. Every mile took him further from everything he had ever known, toward a future that seemed as foreign as the language spoken by other passengers in the car. St. Peter's School materialized before him like something from a British novel, all red brick buildings and manicured lawns that spoke of tradition and discipline. The imposing architecture was designed to inspire respect and perhaps a little intimidation, and it succeeded admirably in both objectives. Other boys moved across the grounds with easy familiarity, their laughter and casual conversations emphasizing just how much of an outsider Farrokh truly was. The dormitory assignment proved to be both blessing and curse. Surrounded by dozens of other boys, he was never technically alone, yet the loneliness felt more acute than if he had been isolated completely. His roommates were friendly enough, but their easy camaraderie had been built over months and years of shared experience that he could never duplicate. They spoke of holidays at home, family traditions, and local customs with an intimacy that made his own stories of Zanzibar seem exotic and distant. Night brought the cruelest reminders of his displacement. While other boys settled into sleep with the confidence of belonging, Farrokh lay on his narrow bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds and trying to imagine his parents' evening routine hundreds of miles away. Were they sitting at the piano playing the songs they had shared? Was his mother looking at his empty place at the dinner table? Did his father still check his room each night before retiring? A habit that had always made Farrokh feel safe and loved? The academic rigors of St. Peter's demanded immediate attention, leaving little time for extended wallowing in homesickness. Classes began early and ended late, with study periods that stretched well into the evening. Farrokh discovered that his education in Zanzibar, while loving, had not fully prepared him for the intensity and competition of an elite Indian boarding school. Mathematics, English literature, and sciences were taught with a precision and depth that both challenged and occasionally overwhelmed him. Language became both barrier and bridge in his new environment. While his English was excellent, the rapid-fire Hindi and Gujarati conversations around him often left him feeling excluded from the social rhythms of school life. He found himself gravitating toward other students who, like him, seemed to exist on the margins of the established social order. These outsiders formed loose alliances based on shared displacement rather than deep friendship, finding comfort in their mutual understanding of not quite belonging. Letters home became lifelines to his former existence, carefully crafted documents that balanced honesty about his struggles with reassurance that he was adapting successfully. He wrote of academic achievements and new friendships while omitting the In the fading light of a September evening in 1958, a 12-year-old boy named Farrokh Bulsara stood at the entrance of St. Peter's School in Panchgani, India, clutching a small suitcase that contained everything familiar from his world. His parents, Bomi and Jair Bulsara, had made the most difficult decision of their lives. They were sending their beloved son away, not out of indifference, but out of a love so profound it demanded sacrifice. In the colonial administration of Zanzibar, where political tensions simmered beneath the surface of everyday life, they knew that their son's future depended on an education they could not provide at home. The British boarding school system, with all its promise and prestige, would give Farrokh opportunities they themselves had never known. But as they watched their son disappear through those imposing gates, they carried with them a heartbreak that would echo through the years. Farrokh had grown up in the vibrant multicultural world of Stone Town, Zanzibar, where the Indian Ocean breeze carried the scents of spices and the sounds of multiple languages mingled in the marketplace. His father worked as a cashier for the British Colonial Office, a position that provided stability but modest means for their small family. Their home was filled with the warmth of Parsi traditions, the gentle guidance of Zoroastrian values, and the unconditional love that binds a close-knit family together. Farrokh was their only son, the center of their universe, a bright and sensitive child whose imagination seemed to stretch as wide as the ocean horizon he could see from their windows. The political climate in Zanzibar was shifting like sand dunes in the wind. Revolution was whispered about in corners, and families like the Bulsaras, who had built their lives serving the colonial administration, found themselves increasingly vulnerable. Bomi and Jer watched the signs with growing concern. They had witnessed other families torn apart by sudden political upheavals, had seen how quickly stability could dissolve into chaos. Their love for Farrokh became inseparable from their fear for his future. The decision to send him to boarding school in India was not made lightly or quickly. It was the result of countless sleepless nights, whispered conversations after Farrokh had gone to bed, and the gradual realization that keeping him close might mean limiting his possibilities forever. St. Peter's School in Panchgani was renowned throughout the region as an institution that could transform bright young minds into leaders and scholars. Founded on British educational principles, it promised discipline, academic excellence, and the kind of character formation that would serve students throughout their lives. For families across East Africa and India, securing a place at St. Peter's was both an achievement and an investment in their children's futures. But for a 12-year-old boy who had never spent a night away from his parents, the school's reputation could not ease the overwhelming sense of abandonment that settled in his chest like a stone. The journey from Zanzibar to Panchgani was Farrokh's first real experience of the vastness of the world beyond his island home. As the ship carried him across the Indian Ocean toward Bombay, he pressed his face against the porthole window, watching the only world he had ever known disappear into the distance. The other passengers, mostly other children being sent to various boarding schools, chattered excitedly about their adventures ahead, but Farrokh remained largely silent, processing the magnitude of this separation in his own quiet way. From Bombay, the train journey into the Western Ghats Mountains took him through landscapes he had only seen in geography books, but the beauty of the rolling hills and tea plantations felt muted by his homesickness. Panchgani itself was a revelation of sorts. Nestled in the Sahyadri mountain range at an altitude that kept it cool even during the hottest months, the hill station had been developed by the British as a retreat from the oppressive heat of the Indian plains. The town's colonial architecture, manicured gardens, and orderly streets created an atmosphere of disciplined tranquility that was both impressive and intimidating to a young boy accustomed to the chaotic vibrancy of Stone Town. St. Peter's School occupied a prominent position on one of the hills, its red brick buildings and manicured lawns projecting an air of institutional authority that seemed designed to remind students of their place in the grand scheme of empire and education. The first weeks at St. Peter's were perhaps the most challenging of Farrokh's young life. The regimented schedule that governed every moment from dawn until lights out left little room for the kind of free-flowing creativity that had characterized his childhood in Zanzibar. Morning assembly, classes, meals, study periods, sports, and evening prayers followed each other with mechanical precision. The other boys, many of whom had been at boarding school for years, seemed to navigate this world with ease, but Farrokh felt like he was constantly struggling to find his footing on unfamiliar ground. The dormitory where he slept was a long room lined with iron beds, each boy's small space defined by a narrow locker and a few personal possessions that had to be kept in perfect order. Homesickness hit Farrokh with an intensity that surprised even him. At night, lying in his narrow bed, surrounded by the breathing and occasional snoring of dozens of other boys, he would close his eyes and try to transport himself back to Zanzibar. He could almost smell his mother's cooking wafting from their kitchen, almost hear his father's voice reading the evening newspaper aloud, almost feel the warm breeze that used to blow through his bedroom window from the ocean. The letters from home, when they arrived, were both a lifeline and a source of renewed sadness. His parents wrote cheerfully about daily life in Stone Town, about neighbors and family friends, about small incidents and observations that had once been the fabric of his everyday existence. But reading these letters also emphasized how far removed he was from that world, how much he was missing with each passing day. The academic demands at St. Peter's were rigorous in a way that Farrokh had never experienced. The British-style education emphasized not just memorization, but critical thinking, essay writing, and the kind of analytical skills that would prepare students for university and professional life. Mathematics, English literature, history, geography, and sciences were taught by masters who expected excellence and accepted nothing less than complete effort from their students. Farrokh, who had always been a bright student, found himself challenged in new ways. The competition among his classmates was fierce but generally good-natured, creating an environment where academic achievement was both expected and celebrated. Despite the initial overwhelming nature of boarding school life, Farrokh gradually began to discover aspects of St. Peter's that offered comfort and even joy. The school's emphasis on extracurricular activities meant that students were encouraged to explore interests beyond the classroom. There were debates and drama productions, sports teams and hobby clubs, opportunities for creativity and self-expression that helped boys develop their individual talents and personalities. The library became one of Farrokh's favorite retreats, a quiet sanctuary where he could lose himself in books that transported him to other worlds and other times. He developed a particular love for adventure stories and biographies of great men, reading about explorers and inventors, artists and leaders who had overcome obstacles to achieve extraordinary things. One evening, restless and unable to focus on his studies, Farrokh found himself wandering the corridors of the school after the official end of study period. Most of the other boys had settled into their dormitories or were gathered in the common rooms, but something drew him toward a part of the building he had rarely explored. Following his curiosity down a hallway lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, he discovered a door slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the corridor from within. Pushing the door open quietly, he stepped into what was clearly the school's music room. The space was modest but inviting, with wooden floors that showed the wear of countless students over the decades. Music stands were arranged in neat rows, suggesting regular rehearsals and lessons. Along one wall, various instruments hung in careful organization, violins and flutes, drums and brass instruments that caught the light from the electric bulbs overhead. But what captured Farrokh's attention immediately was the piano positioned near the tall windows that looked out over the school grounds toward the Eats valley below. It was an old instrument, its dark wood scarred and polished by years of use, but it possessed a dignity and presence that seemed to fill the room. Farrokh approached it slowly, almost reverently, drawn by something he could not quite name. He had seen pianos before, of course, in the homes of wealthy families in Zanzibar and in some of the public buildings where formal events were held, but he had never been alone with one, never had the opportunity to explore its possibilities without adult supervision or social constraint. The bench was positioned at just the right height, and as Farrokh settled onto it, he felt a strange sense of rightness, as if he belonged in this exact spot. The keys stretched before him in their familiar pattern of black and white, each one promising a different sound, a different note in an infinite symphony of possibilities. He placed his hands on the keyboard tentatively at first, feeling the smooth. In the music room of St. Peter's School in Panchgani, four boys huddle around a battered upright piano, their voices echoing off the stone walls. The year is 1962, and among them stands a 14-year-old boy named Farrokh Bulsara, his fingers dancing across worn keys with an intensity that surprises even his closest friends. What started as casual jamming sessions has evolved into something extraordinary, something that would plant the first seeds of a legend the world would one day know as Freddie Mercury. The formation of the Hectics didn't happen overnight. For nearly 4 years, Farrokh had wandered the corridors of St. Peter's like a ghost, carrying the weight of separation from his family in Zanzibar. The boarding school, perched high in the western Ghats of Maharashtra, had been both sanctuary and prison for the lonely boy who spoke Gujarati at home but dreamed in melodies. Music had been his companion during those solitary evenings when homesickness threatened to consume him. But now, for the first time since his parents had made that heartbreaking decision to send him away, he wasn't alone. The other members of the Hectics were as passionate about music as Farrokh himself. Derek Branch wielded his guitar with the confidence of someone who had discovered his calling early, while Bruce Murray's bass lines provided the steady foundation that anchored their sound. Victory Rana completed the quartet behind the drums, his rhythms driving their covers of popular rock and roll songs with infectious energy. Together, they represented something rare in the conservative atmosphere of an Indian boarding school, a group of young men who dared to embrace the rebellious spirit of Western rock music during an era when such expressions were often viewed with suspicion. Their rehearsal space became a sacred ground where transformation occurred daily. The music room, with its high ceilings and dusty windows that filtered the afternoon light into golden streams, witnessed the gradual metamorphosis of a shy, introspective boy into something entirely different. When Farrokh sat at the piano, his posture changed, his voice found new depths, and his confidence soared beyond the confines of adolescent uncertainty. The other boys noticed it first, the way he commanded attention without demanding it, the way his interpretations of familiar songs carried an emotional weight that left them all slightly breathless. The Hectics began performing at school functions, their reputation spreading through the dormitories and classrooms like wildfire. Word of the young pianist with the extraordinary voice reached beyond the school walls, and soon they were invited to perform at local events in Panchgani and surrounding areas. Each performance was a revelation, not just for the audiences who witnessed their raw talent, but for Farrokh himself, who discovered that the stage was where he truly belonged. The isolation that had once defined his existence at St. Peter's began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that he had never experienced before. The music they played was a reflection of the times, covers of popular rock and roll songs that filtered into India through radio broadcasts and imported records. Chuck Berry's guitar riffs, Little Richard's explosive vocals, and the harmonies of early rock groups became the foundation of their repertoire. But even in those early performances, Farrokh's unique interpretation shone through, his voice carrying nuances and emotional depths that hinted at the extraordinary artist he would eventually become. His bandmates recognized something special in their piano player, a quality that elevated their performances beyond mere covers into something approaching artistry. The shy boy who had arrived at St. Peter's 4 years earlier was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood the power of performance, the magic of connecting with an audience through music. During their rehearsals, Farrokh began experimenting with his stage presence, testing different vocal techniques, and exploring the theatrical elements that would later define his legendary performances. His natural charisma, suppressed for years by loneliness and displacement, began to emerge like a flower reaching towards sunlight. The other students at St. Peter's started to see Farrokh differently. No longer was he simply the quiet boy from Zanzibar who kept to himself. He was now the pianist from the Hectics, the one with the voice that could make even the most skeptical listener stop and pay attention. This transformation was profound, affecting not just how others perceived him, but how he saw himself. For the first time in years, he felt truly valued, not just for his academic achievements or his ability to conform to school expectations, but for his artistic gifts. The influence of the Hectics extended beyond their immediate circle, inspiring other students to explore their own musical interests and challenging the rigid academic atmosphere that had previously defined life at St. Peter's. Their success demonstrated that creativity and artistic expression could thrive even within the structured environment of a boarding school, paving the way for future generations of students to pursue their passions without shame or reservation. As the Hectics continued to perform and grow in popularity, Farrokh began to understand something fundamental about himself and his relationship with music. This wasn't simply a hobby or a way to pass time during his years at boarding school. This was his calling, his path toward becoming the person he was meant to be. The piano bench where he spent countless hours practicing became his throne, the music room his kingdom, and his bandmates his first loyal subjects in what would eventually become a global empire of sound and spectacle. The transformation that occurred during those formative years with the Hectics was more than just musical, it was psychological and spiritual. The boy who had been sent away from home to protect him from political upheaval had found his true home in music, his real family in the brotherhood of musicians who shared his passion and understood his vision. The loneliness that had once threatened to define his character was replaced by a sense of community and purpose that would sustain him through all the challenges that lay ahead. Years later, when Freddie Mercury commanded stages across the world, captivating audiences of hundreds of thousands with his magnetic presence and incomparable voice, those who knew him during his time with the Hectics would recognize the seeds of greatness that had first sprouted in that humble music room at St. Peter's School. The confidence, the charisma, the absolute certainty that music was his destiny, all of these qualities could be traced back to those early days when four boys gathered around a battered piano and dared to dream of something greater than the limitations that surrounded them. The Hectics represented more than just Farrokh's first band. They were his introduction to the transformative power of musical collaboration, his first taste of the adoration that would later define his relationship with audiences worldwide, and his initial understanding that music could be a bridge between the boy he had been and the legend he would become. In that dusty music room, surrounded by friends who believed in his talent and encouraged his artistic growth, the foundation was laid for one of the greatest performers in the history of rock music. The luggage sits by the door like a silent monument to heartbreak. 12-year-old Farrokh Bulsara stares at the worn leather suitcase, its brass corners catching the morning light that streams through the windows of his family home in Stone Town, Zanzibar. His mother, Jer, moves quietly around the room, folding his school uniforms with the precise care of someone trying not to cry. His father, Bomi, stands at the window, shoulders rigid with the weight of a decision that will haunt him for years to come. In just hours, their son will board a ship that will take him across the Indian Ocean to a boarding school in India, 1,500 miles away from everything he has ever known. This is not a story of abandonment. This is not a tale of parents who love too little. This is the profound tragedy and ultimate triumph of parents who love too much, who understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. The year is 1958, and the Bulsara family is about to make a sacrifice that will echo through the decades, ultimately giving the world one of its most extraordinary performers. But in this moment, in this room thick with unspoken grief, they are simply a family being torn apart by the brutal mathematics of colonial education and the fierce determination of parents who refuse to let their son's potential be buried beneath the limitations of their circumstances. Farrokh has been accepted to St. Peter's School in Panchgani, a hill station in the western Ghats of Maharashtra. The school is renowned for its academic excellence and its British-style education system. For a Parsi family living in Zanzibar, where educational opportunities are limited and the political climate grows increasingly uncertain, this represents their son's ticket to a future they themselves could never have imagined. But the cost is not measured in rupees or shillings. The cost is measured in empty chairs at the dinner table, in birthdays celebrated through letters that take weeks to arrive, in a childhood that will unfold in the shadow of separation. Bomi Bulsara works as a cashier at the British Colonial Office, a position that affords the family a modest but stable life in Stone Town's Indian Quarter. He has spent countless evenings calculating and recalculating the finances, stretching their budget to accommodate not just the school fees, but also the cost of uniforms, books, and the regular passage between Zanzibar and India. Jer, meanwhile, has sewn name tags into every piece of clothing, as if these small acts of maternal care could somehow bridge the vast distance that will soon separate her from her son. They know what they are doing, they know the price they're paying, and they know it is worth every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every tear shed in private. The decision to send Farrokh to boarding school is not made lightly or suddenly. It represents years of discussion, planning, and sacrifice. The Bulsara family understands that education is the great equalizer, the pathway to opportunities that have been historically denied to colonial subjects. They have watched other families make similar choices, seen how children who receive proper education in prestigious institutions return home transformed, equipped with the tools to navigate a changing world. They have also seen the cost of keeping children close to home, watch talented young people become trapped by circumstance, their potential withering for lack of opportunity. The morning of departure arrives with cruel indifference to the family's emotional state. Farrokh sits at the breakfast table, pushing his food around his plate, appetite lost to the churning anxiety in his stomach. He is 12 years old, an age when the world still feels magical and infinite, when the idea of being away from home for months at a time seems both thrilling and terrifying. He has never been away from his parents for more than a night. He has never lived among strangers. He has never had to navigate the complex social dynamics of institutional life. Yet here he sits, preparing to embark on a journey that will fundamentally reshape who he is and who he will become. The journey to India begins at Stone Town's harbor, where the family makes their way through crowds of merchants, laborers, and other travelers. The ship that will carry Farrokh across the Indian Ocean looms massive and imposing, its smokestacks reaching toward the cloudless African sky. Other families are saying their goodbyes, their tears and embraces creating a symphony of separation that echoes across the dock. Jer holds her son close, whispering words of encouragement and love, trying to compress years of maternal guidance into these final precious moments. Bomi places a firm hand on his son's shoulder, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, reminding Farrokh that this sacrifice is an investment in his future, a gift that will pay dividends for the rest of his life. As the ship pulls away from the harbor, Farrokh stands at the rail, watching Stone Town shrink into the distance until it becomes just another smudge on the horizon, The Indian Ocean stretches endlessly in all directions, its vastness suddenly representing not adventure but isolation, not opportunity but abandonment. The other passengers move about the deck, chatting and laughing, but Farrokh feels utterly alone, adrift not just on the water but in life itself. He is too young to understand the full implications of what his parents have done for him, too immature to grasp the magnitude of their sacrifice, too inexperienced to recognize that this moment of devastating loneliness is actually the first step on a journey toward extraordinary self-discovery. The voyage to Bombay takes several days, during which Farrokh gradually adjusts to life aboard the ship. He discovers a small piano in the ship's lounge, its keys yellowed with age, but still capable of producing music that somehow eases the ache in his chest. He has always been drawn to music, has always possessed an innate understanding of melody and rhythm that seems to come from some deeper source within him. Now, surrounded by the endless expanse of ocean, he begins to understand that music might be more than just entertainment or hobby. It might be survival itself, a way to transform pain into beauty, loneliness into art. From Bombay, the journey continues by train to Panchgani, a scenic hill station that serves as home to several prestigious boarding schools. The landscape changes dramatically as the train climbs into the Western Ghats, the tropical heat of the coast giving way to the cooler, more temperate climate of the mountains. Farrokh presses his face against the window, watching the countryside roll past, trying to memorize every detail so he can describe it in letters to his parents. He does not yet know that letters will become his lifeline, that the weekly ritual of writing home will become one of the few constants in his drastically altered existence. St. Peter's School sits atop a hill overlooking the Panchgani Valley, its red brick buildings and manicured lawns designed to evoke the great public schools of England. The institution prides itself on producing well-rounded young men equipped for leadership in the modern world. The curriculum emphasizes not just academic excellence, but also character development, physical fitness, and cultural refinement. Students are expected to participate in sports, learn musical instruments, engage in debate and drama, and develop the kind of confidence and poise that will serve them well in whatever careers they choose to pursue. For Farrokh, however, the initial experience is overwhelming and disorienting. He is assigned to a dormitory with a dozen other boys, most of whom seem to possess a sophistication and worldliness that he lacks. Many come from wealthy Indian families or expatriate British households, their conversations filled with references to places and experiences that are completely foreign to a boy from Zanzibar. The social hierarchies of boarding school life are complex and unforgiving, with popularity determined by factors that often have little to do with academic achievement or personal character. Farrokh struggles to find his place in this ecosystem, his natural shyness exacerbated by homesickness and cultural displacement. The academic work is rigorous and demanding, far more challenging than anything he encountered in the schools of Stone Town. The teachers are strict disciplinarians who expect excellence and have little patience for students who fail to meet their high standards. Farrokh throws himself into his studies with the desperate intensity of someone trying to justify his parents' sacrifice, spending long hours in the library, seeking perfect marks that might somehow validate the pain of separation. He writes letter after letter to his family, describing his classes and teachers, carefully omitting any mention of his loneliness or his struggles to fit in among his more privileged classmates. The music room becomes his sanctuary, the one place where he feels truly at home in this strange new environment. St. Peter's has an excellent music program, with well-maintained pianos and a teacher who recognizes Farrokh's natural talent and begins to nurture it with proper instruction. For the first time in his life, he learns to read music formally, to understand the theoretical foundations that underpin the melodies that have always flowed so naturally from his fingers. He discovers classical composers whose work speaks to something deep within him, begins to understand how music can express emotions that words cannot capture. It is in the music room that Farrokh begins to shed some of his shyness and connect with other students who share his passion. He finds himself drawn to boys who are similarly displaced or different.